All right, guys, hopefully I will be able to make this the last installment of this lecture. Okay, so I want to talk just for a moment about how you might organize this paper. Here's just an example of an organization of one paper. For a paper proving the thesis that while this commercial reinforces values associated with the American dream, it also suggests that the American dream has changed to be more individualistic since Scholes was writing. So for that kind of a thesis that's really directed at Scholes, I would probably start after the intro by defining cultural reinforcement using Scholes as examples. And then move into talking about how the paper, how this particular commercial does cultural reinforcement, right? How reinforcement works. Then I might compare it with Scholes' commercial, right? These athletes don't struggle against the same kinds of obstacles. Then from there, this commercial focuses on individualism, and you might talk, and maybe in this particular commercial that the student wrote on, there was a voiceover that made that clear. Then this commercial encourages the viewer to relate to these athletes' struggles, and there was this sort of rolling text at the end. And then sort of pulling these different strands together. We have two different versions of the American dream, one about systemic obstacles and one about doing your personal best. So pulling together Scholes' version of the American dream and this commercial's version. And then finally, in the conclusion, this shift in the American dream as indicative of a change in society since the 1980s. So there's just one possible way you might organize a paper. Here is just some advice as I've been assigning this particular paper for several years now, and here's kind of what I have learned. I would talk about Scholes early in the paper because he needs to be a big part of the paper, right? And if you only let him come in at the end, I will wind up just asking you to go put him in earlier. So make sure you talk about Scholes at least by paragraph 3. You're going to need to have a part of your paper that describes your commercial for someone who hasn't seen it. Remember that Scholes has that paragraph in it. So you might put that in just its own paragraph like Scholes does, or you might distribute the summary of the commercial throughout the rest of the body when you're analyzing it. Remember that every paragraph needs to have evidence and analysis and a bun that ties directly back to your thesis. The one exception being the paragraph, if you put all of your summary of the commercial into a paragraph, you might not have much analysis in that paragraph, but you're going to analyze all that stuff later. And then remember the conclusions are a place where you can step back, zoom out to the picture, and be a little bit more speculative, right? Conclusions. I had this teacher I'll never forget, it was 10th grade, who said that a conclusion is 1 + 1 = 3, right? A conclusion is where you get to kind of gesture towards things that you can't prove fully. So feel free to do that, to kind of zoom out with your commercial, right? With your conclusion. Too many words that sound alike to my failing brain here. Okay. So I want to talk for just a few minutes about MLA style. This is some very basic kind of stuff that you should know. In MLA style, you put your name, the date, my name, the course number up in the left-hand corner, your last name and page number as a header at the top right-hand corner, and you double space, and just upload as an attachment on Blackboard. None of that stuff is nearly as important as the content of the paper, but it's good to be able to follow directions. So MLA is a format, right? Double spacing your paper, etc. But it's also a citation style. And as we get into Essay 3, in week 4, we'll start talking a lot more about citation styles. Things are going to be pretty straightforward for this essay because you only have 2 sources, right? But let's start with some basic vocabulary, right? So we all know that you put a list of your sources at the end of any paper, right? In APA style, they call that a reference list. In MLA style, they call it a works cited. And if you're kind of old school, you call it a bibliography. And entries on your works cited are called citations. So these particular sources that you're citing for this paper are going to be a little bit challenging, just in terms of getting them onto your works cited page, because they're electronic. And even though, we are like many years into like the internet age, still it's harder to cite electronic sources. These citation styles were developed before they existed. What I am going to ask you to do is to please actually deal with the difficulty of citing a YouTube video or and an essay on a website. Don't just use one of those citation generators like EasyBib or whatever. There's only 2 entries. Come on, just think about it. You're going to need to make thoughtful decisions, as there's no completely right or wrong way to cite these sources. There are judgment calls, and I want you to practice. Okay, so just a few principles about why we cite our sources. Okay, so your goal ultimately is to give your readers enough information so they could track down your sources on their own if they wanted to, right? The idea being that they could try to replicate your work if they wanted to. So you want to find as much information as you can about your source and make it fit into the guidelines as best you can. And so why do we want to give your reader this information? So part of it is just the spirit of scholarly inquiry and science, right? We only say what we have evidence for, and our results could be reproduced. That's just part of scholarship. That's part of what it means to do scholarship, to write essays. On the other hand, so that's sort of the morally high reason, and the morally lower reason is that you're trying to cover your own behind, right? You're trying to prove that you did the work that you said you did, and so one implication of this is that you want to cite the version of sources that you accessed on the website where you got Scholes' essay. You're going to see that they cite the original print version. You don't want to just use their citation for the print version, because that's not the version you accessed. So what if they took something out? You want to cover your own behind, right? Which means you want to cite the version that you accessed. So you'll see under Reading and Resources on our Blackboard page, there's a link to Purdue OWL, the online writing lab at Purdue. And that's a really useful website that I'm sure most of you have used before, that gives you lots of great information about citing sources. So I want you guys, so basically when you're constructing your works cited page for this essay, what I want you to do is to just go over to OWL, look up MLA works cited page, and look at the kinds of categories they list for how you cite different kinds of sources, and find the categories that your sources fit into the best. Basically, this is what they suggest for electronic sources: an author or editor name, if available, article name in quotation marks, title of the website, project, or book in italics, and so on and so on. Right? You can pause here and look at this more carefully. You can certainly just go over to OWL and look it up yourself. I'm making you go to OWL yourself because then you'll know how to do it, and you can do it later after this class. One thing I will point out is that in MLA style, you do put down the date you accessed material, but you no longer include a full URL ordinarily, unless it's a very difficult to find URL. So one thing just to explain for inquiring minds is that article names go in quotation marks, and titles of websites or books or whole projects go in italics. And the reasoning for that, sort of the method behind the madness, is that the part gets quotation marks and the whole gets italics. So the same thing goes for a chapter in a book, a song on an album, an episode in a series. Whenever you have a part and a whole, the part gets quotation marks and the whole gets italics. Okay, so you have to cite that Scholes essay, but then you also have to cite your commercial. For the vast majority of you, that's going to be a YouTube video because that's how you access your commercial. You have some choices you have to make. Citing a YouTube video is not 100% straightforward. You have to decide, so, we ordinarily have a place for an author. So what do you use for an author? Do you use the username of the person who uploaded the video in the place of the author? In the place of, do you present the username of the person who uploaded the video in the place of the author? Do you put the company that made the commercial there? Or do you just not say that there's an author and just lead with the title? I think that there are pros and cons to each of those three things you might do. Using the username, the company, or as the author, or just not having an author. I think that there are, you have to decide what you think is the best for your commercial. Do you include the URL, especially if it's a commercial where there's a lot of different versions? And with most of these commercials, you can find a lot of different versions. Does that mean that you should include the URL, even though ordinarily we don't? So my point here is that citing actually does, a lot of times, present intellectual problems that require thought to sort out. This is like this is my favorite way to cite YouTube. Even though you will definitely find advice, even on Purdue OWL, to cite differently than this. This is my favorite way. You do not feel that you have to use my way. So long as you have reasons for citing the way you do, you're good. So I like to put the actual username as the author because I just feel like that's safest. Then the title of the video, then YouTube, in italics as the site that compiles these videos, then the medium, and then the date accessed. The medium, web, and the date accessed, those are easy because MLA always uses those. So that's my model for citing YouTube. You can choose a different method. I might ask you to explain to me why you cited the way you did, but that's fine. Cool. Okay, so for your draft, I want a works cited page. Try. These are difficult sources to cite. They are not straightforward. I know that. but I want you to give it a whirl. So you guys are turning in your essay this week, and you're going to post it twice. You're going to post it both as on the discussion board. And you're going to post it, you're going to upload it as an assignment. That means you're going to get two kinds of comments. You're going to get comments from your peers, because our discussion board for week 3 is going to be a peer review. And then also you're going to get comments from me. What I want to emphasize here is that a done draft is a good draft, right? In my class, we work with the theory of the shitty first draft, which is that you have to start somewhere, right? And drafts do not spring perfectly formed out of our minds. So you get all the points for making a decent effort that's long enough, not plagiarized, and submitted in the right place. You can only screw up in 2 ways. Plagiarize, right? Like Google the school's essay, copy what other people say, buy a paper off the internet, or get stressed out and don't turn the paper in. Those are the only ways you can mess up at this point. So don't mess up in either of those ways. Okay, I will put lots of instructions for the peer review and some advice about how to make a peer review useful on the discussion board for next week. In the meantime, you guys go write those essays and just email me if there's anything you want to run by me. Okay, bye guys. Have a good one. I will see you next week from someplace in Italy.